Good morning. My name is Dennis Small of Executive Intelligence Review, and this is November 7th, Friday, November 7th, 2025. As we speak this morning, the USS Gerald R, the aircraft carrier, is steaming on its way across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. It passed through the Strait of Gibraltar about 2 days ago. It's expected to arrive in the Caribbean to join the rest of American forces there in 4, perhaps 5 days. So by the middle of next week, the United States will have amassed off the coast of Venezuela a force which is larger than the military force the United States had in place in the Mediterranean around the time of the Israeli and American attacks on Iran. We have, with the Gerald Ford, 4 squadrons of F-18 fighter jets. There is already about 10,000 troops available in the region, the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group. The United States has rebuilt an air base in Puerto Rico. There is a substantial force in place. And of course, there have been repeated threats, warnings, and more threats coming from Washington against the Maduro government in Venezuela. This is occurring in the context of an extreme danger on an even larger scale, which is the United States-Russian crisis and confrontation, or potential confrontation, I should say, because after the Alaska summit between the presidents of the United States and Russia, there has been growing tension, in particular around the recent announcement by President Trump that the United States will engage in nuclear testing. And no one has quite been able to figure out exactly what that means, but the Russians are testing themselves, not nuclear weapons, but nuclear delivery systems, missiles, and so on, with some very important breakthroughs in the capabilities like the Burevestnik. Perhaps the clearest statement of the Russian policy on this, of what Trump is saying, came from Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Security Council of Russia, who said the following on November 5th. "No one knows what Trump means about nuclear testing. He probably doesn't know himself, but he's the president of the United States, and the consequences of such words are inescapable. Russia will be forced to assess the expediency of conducting full-fledged nuclear tests itself." Close quote. So in this broad strategic context, with the Venezuela crisis, or the Caribbean crisis, reaching a very dangerous point, an important statement was issued on November 5th by the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPS, which is a group of distinguished former U.S. intelligence officials, a group formed in January 2003, with a warning to the Trump administration, advice and recommendations as well about the danger of this crisis. And this is a document that was signed by, among others, our guest today, Graham Fuller. Graham was a former U.S. diplomat and CIA official. He's an Islamic scholar, and he served as vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council in the mid-1980s, if I'm not mistaken, which reports directly to the Director of National Intelligence. So, Graham, what can you tell us about this statement of the VIPS, about the Venezuela crisis, and how you are looking at this situation?
Well, I think the VIPS represents a very important organization and concept within the, let's say, the outlying parts of the U.S. government, simply because it represents a lot of people from the intelligence community who have had a great deal of experience, both in Washington, in policy formulation, working overseas operations, et cetera, and by now I've seen a lot of history go by. So I think it represents one of the few, in theory, most professional organizations to call on the president directly and ask him to pay greater attention to the organization and the work of the intelligence community in the United States. Now, that sounds like a very anodyne statement, of course. Why not? But we all know, and especially myself and Ray McGovern, and many, many others who are associated with this group, we all know that there's been gross corruption of the integrity of the intelligence process over the past, perhaps, several decades. The most egregious example, of course, being the attack and war, disastrous war against Iraq. So, unfortunately, this seems to be a growing development whereby intelligence itself is being heavily politicized and written up in such a way as to conform to the policy goals and ambitions of the president and not necessarily in conformity with reality.
It seems, Graham, that the VIPS statement is kind of a double warning. On the one hand, of the dangers of an actual war getting out of control in the Caribbean and perhaps involving uh, the Russians, the Chinese, not because of direct military involvement. You don't say that in the statement, but supplying equipment, military equipment to Venezuela, which is an ally of Russia's in his signed statements. But also, it's a warning in the direction of the Trump administration itself. Uh, just to read a quote or two to get your further views on this, you say in this statement, "We're deeply concerned about where the United States seems to be headed in its Venezuela policy and urge you, President Trump, to demand that the intelligence community give you clear, unfiltered, truth to power analysis. Flying blind into an unprovoked war against a Latin American government is going to be a problem. We have seen this before, like in the case of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq." So, am I right in thinking that this is a double warning that is being issued here?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think it's trying to draw attention. Well, first of all, Dennis, I think it's important to realize what is going on here. Why, in the middle of an appalling genocidal war that the U.S. is backing Israel in Gaza, and then the brutal war in Ukraine, which now seems to be coming to an end. What is exactly the purpose of launching even the suggestion of a further war? What purpose does this serve? I think that's the question. I don't know that, I doubt that Trump himself can actually answer that, except it's a well-known phenomenon among many leaders that when things start going wrong, you go to war and sort of unite the country. But so this is really, I think, a warning shot across the bow to suggest that, okay, this may not be the end of the world, but we're yet drifting into another one of these classic scenarios of a war that seems relatively pointless, cannot likely achieve anything, and that will end up miring the United States into a true quagmire. I I I doubt, I think you had said yourself, Dennis, earlier somewhere, that it's improbable that there will be a direct military confrontation between the United States and Russia over Venezuela, much less with China. But nonetheless, when I mention a warning shot across the bow, that warning shot is even more importantly coming from Russia and China, who once again are saying, look, the old way of doing business in the world is over. We will no longer automatically accept the United States' right or ability to act with impunity wherever it wants, to intervene in foreign countries, to overthrow regimes and color revolutions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the principle is extremely important, and it's a principle that will resonate with certainly the broader global developing global South movements like the BRICS and everything else. So I think there's a far greater awareness and alertness now, particularly to that problem as a result of the especially the formulation of the BRICS. The old world is not there anymore, and the consequences and the price to be paid will be ever higher. And I think the indignation on the part of so many developing countries and global South will be ever greater as a result of this seemingly pointless exercise, which doesn't even seem to be directly and credibly related to narcotic trafficking.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence that it's really not related to that. Venezuela, the DEA itself, the UNODC itself, have said that Venezuela is a minor player in the drug trade. And what EIR has often said is if you want to stop the drug trade, the first place to shut down is Wall Street and the City of London, who are the ones
Yeah.
that launder $1 trillion a year in drug money. But that's a whole different topic. But the this issue of the rising opposition to these kinds of forever wars, it's certainly the case, as you say, that across Ibero-America at this point, even among countries that are by no means close allies of Venezuela, you're finding tremendous opposition to this because they're looking around and saying, well, we could we next. This is a principle of intervention that's simply not acceptable. To put a fine point on it, one could ask the following question. What do the following phrases have in common? Reichstag fire, Gulf of Tonkin, September 11th, Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, Iran's nuclear bomb, and now Venezuela drugs. Isn't that the kind of thing that we're really seeing here?
That's exactly right. I mean, these are all phrases that are very emotive. And when you say you're going to war on behalf of any of these particular causes, I think you can get some resonance, especially from people not terribly well informed about the issues at hand here. So. Yeah, I think your point is very important, Dennis, that there are many countries out there that do not like Venezuela, probably don't like the U.S. either, but may have more sympathy with other economic policies for the region. But the fact is that I don't think there's not going to be any coalition of the willing, if you will, either for or against such a war. But I certainly think the voices of the much of the rest of the world will be very powerful on this particular issue. I just might add here too. I used the word impunity a couple of minutes ago, but I think we're living in a time now with this horrendous genocidal war in Gaza. And impunity is exactly the word that matters here. Can countries, and not, especially as driven the model driven by Israel, attack, assassinate, kill, maim, close borders, open borders, block international action, et cetera, with impunity? And I think the United States perhaps has sadly been emboldened by the actions of Israel that really doesn't give a damn what anybody else thinks. And I think Trump feels somewhat, wow, maybe this is the way to go. If we're going to be a great power, is that we should still maintain the right to act with impunity.
Yeah. The it's the descent into the law of the jungle, the idea that might makes right, and the world of Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, as opposed to a world of respect for sovereignty and a world in which the interest of one is based on the development and interests of the others. That's the issue that you just raised in terms of the BRICS and the global south and so on. So we can certainly agree that the issue is not drugs, even though that's what they're talking about. It's just objectively not the case. Um, but on
Well,
the
and
question of China,
Dan, I don't want to interrupt you on
no,
this,
no,
Dennis,
please.
but I mean, I think it gets worse in the sense that I and all kinds of other people, younger officers joining the U.S. government for years, and even those outside the U.S. government, have been drawn and attracted by the idea of wars for the sake of democracy, wars for the sake of the protection of human rights globally. I think the massive disillusionment on the part of many former intelligence officers and diplomats, American diplomats as well, is an awareness that that's not really what's been going on. This has been the pretext, the banner to protect human rights, to protect democracy or restore democracy. Um, the pretext for wars that are really founded on much cruder aims.
Yeah, exactly. This is not really the American system approach by any means. But on the question of the global south and China and Russia, two related questions. If the issue is not drugs, what is actually the strategic interest and what's going on here, number one? And number two, what do you see, looking at this from a global perspective, as what Russia and China's response will be or could be in this Caribbean situation?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the first question. We can get to that. On the second part, I think it has now been clear for quite a long time, especially with the involvement of China now in international affairs much more prominently, that again the old order is disappearing, and the old order is increasingly less acceptable to most of the rest of the world, and particularly to China or to Russia, as we witness in the war in Ukraine. So I think this is just another doubling down on the reminder that the world is much ever less willing to accept unilateral action on the part of former great powers, former colonial powers, especially Europe, obviously,
Mhm.
become engaged in these wars that go nowhere and are extraordinarily costly, and that I think the BRICS and other countries are determined that they not become part of a newer world order, if you will, as one develops. That there's got to be a greater equity of involvement in choice and voice that we certainly do not see in today's UN Security Council, which is almost a classic collection of former imperial powers.
Mhm.
Not,
Yeah. Well, let me explain the first part of the question. That definitely answers the second. And I'm going to do that by showing you and our viewers two maps for your consideration. And I'll try to do this with share screen, and it will hopefully work. The question of China's global development approach through the Belt and Road Initiative, working with the BRICS, and so on, has attracted the support and participation of over 150 countries around the world, regardless of their view of Chinese ideology or political thinking or anything like that. The fact is that they have raised 850 million people out of poverty in a 40-year period, and they have built 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and they are involved in a physical economic production expansion, including high technology, science, and so on. Now, what I'm showing on the screen here, I hope it's visible, it should be, is a schematic map of the World Land Bridge of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I would like to draw your attention to South America, Venezuela. I don't know if my cursor shows up here, but Venezuela is on the northern coast of South America, on the Caribbean.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the activities of China in the region include the building with Peru of the Chancay port on the Pacific,
yeah,
which is a major megaport with
absolutely.
direct transport. And what is now, and that's opened up. What's now on the agenda and under discussion is the building of a bioceanic rail corridor, the yellow line there, which goes across, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific on South America. That kind of expansion of economic activity in cooperation with China is one thing that has been going on. And I would counterpose that, this is the question for you, to statements coming from US policymakers, such as, or in this case, a policy implementer, the former head of the Southern Command, Admiral Alvin Halsey, who stated in August of this year, quote, China continues its methodical incursion in the region, seeking to export its authoritarian model, extract precious resources, and set the theater with potential dual-use infrastructure from ports to space. Dual-use infrastructure, in other words, things that can be used for war or for development. And that statement says China can't be allowed in the region. Do you think that's a factor in what we're seeing in Venezuela right now?
Absolutely. I think it's quite I was myself a bit surprised to see the sudden resuscitation of the Western Hemisphere into deep geopolitical discussion over the past several months and years, because obviously the center of action, if you will, has been in East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, parts of Africa, Europe, et cetera, et cetera. But the Western Hemisphere has not figured in global international views quite as much as before. Now it is. I'm not sure where this is coming from. I think this would be extremely important even to investigate in its own right. Is this because the U.S. is essentially pulling back from the rest of the world, saying we can't compete, but this is our hunk of turf, and by God, we're going to control it? Or I don't know what's going on here, but there's been no explicit statement other than the fact that this is our black backyard, and that's not a statement of geopolitical planning whatsoever. So I I it comes down, Dennis, to another very fundamental difference between the Chinese approach to international relations over, let's say, the past 20 years and the United States approach over the past 40, 50 years. The United States has essentially run a military-oriented foreign policy in which the key tactic, and I've worked in some of these things when I was at Rand Corporation, the identification of the enemy. This is a major American, uh, if you will, an industry, a small industry, in identifying potential clash points everywhere, which in itself can become and does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I tell you, Dennis, that I view you as my peer competitor and my clear challenge, that's a real statement to you about how I'm going to start dealing with you. It's quite notable that China, on the other hand, has avoided any effort to try to draw other countries into military alliances. The U.S. approach is to draw people, to create the threat, and then say, okay, guys, we've got your back. We'll all get together and create this organization so that we can meet X, Y, or Z threat. China has not done that at all and has operated rather with economic goals. Now we could say, well, what are the Chinese up to? What is their intent? That's a whole other discussion in international competition. But I don't think the Chinese have ever thought of military alliances as the way as building blocks for a future world order.
Yeah. No, I think that point's very well taken. And we have these two different approaches going on right now. In the world of geopolitics, it looks like they're headbutting and there's no way out. On the other hand, perhaps at the level of real statecraft, there is a way, as Nicholas of Cusa would say, to find the coincidence of opposites. What about the following idea? Here is another map. What if the United States and China could and would cooperate in the development of the region? That is to say, take American interests, capabilities, and also Chinese capabilities in rail and so on. This is a map which Executive Intelligence Review produced to give an indication of what could be done with the construction of rail lines across the area up through Central America into Mexico, that turn the entire Caribbean into a hub of development. And in this way, solve the problem of drugs, solve the problem of migrants, solve the problems which Trump points to in the United States as very real problems, but perhaps with a solution if the United States worked with China in the development of this area that would take us into an entirely different approach to global politics. What say you to that?
It makes too much sense, Dennis. The major problem right now, as I've seen it for a decade at the very least, is a declining U.S. power. And the inability of the United States to acknowledge this, to recognize it, to deal with the problem one of the fundamental sources of these conflicts. We know we're number one. We're not going to back off from being number one. We're the world's leading global superpower, economic, technical, blah, 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 whatever else. I think the change of mindset in the United States to move away from a recognition of saying, well, guys, we had a terrific run of 250 years and we contributed a lot and we're proud of it and we still have things to contribute, but the world has changed and we're now going to have to work successfully with other countries to improve the opportunities for global development. I mean, it's economically entirely feasible, as your maps show. Your very creative maps show what could be done here, there, and elsewhere. I think the United States is very, very far still from acknowledging that it is no longer just number one and that it should be willing to work alongside of a country that it officially announces to be the peer competitor, and in which such cooperation would, in theory, only lead to the benefit of that peer competitor. It's a mindset issue. It's a mindset.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And these kinds of projects, as you know, not just for the Caribbean, but the Bering Strait Tunnel as a
Yeah.
cooperation for US Russia, the Oasis Plan for the Southwest Asia region, and so on. Here's my final question to you. You've been in government for decades. You've had experience all around the world. You're a scholar. You're familiar with history, not just American history, but in the broader context. You, Graham Fuller, are now the sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. As John Quincy Adams, how do you approach this situation? What should Washington do under these conditions?
Well, that's an unfair question,
I
Dennis.
admit it's very unfair, and that's why I
But
asked it.
that's why you're asking. And of course, it's the question to be asked. I think I think a great deal of it has to do with how one views the nature, the potential nature of international relations. I refer here, for example, to a scholar, a distinguished scholar, well known to both of us, John Mearsheimer, who has written the book literally on international relations, and who I think is a brilliant analyst of ongoing military affairs in the Middle East, in Ukraine and elsewhere. But John also has this, what he calls realism, is this somehow the sense that when you have two great powers, that inevitably, almost mechanically, they're destined to clash. I think he's a great analyst in the Middle East and in the Ukraine because he doesn't follow his own beliefs on all these kind of things. You said it yourself in part, is the paradigm by which one views the nature of relations between states, major and minor. And I would emphasize above all else here the question of human agency which I know Helga has talked about, you've talked about many. This is a very important concept. We are not simply billiard balls on a table, and if you hit the ball in this direction, it hits that ball in that other direction. I'm grossly oversimplifying John Mearsheimer's views of the world, but not completely. I mean, I think he sees a certain, excuse me, kind of an inevitability of clash. And yes, he's not saying it has to be war, but I think it's an acceptance of the fact that diplomacy and human agency and choice always must have a place in the development of international relations. We've talked about this before. I mean, look, the United States was the enemy of Great Britain, and then Great Britain was the enemy of France and in Canada, and then it was, France and Germany, and Britain and Germany, and Russia and China. These are all, in theory, written in stone kind of confrontational relationships. But we also see that this changes overnight. If you say, I don't want to go there, I'm not going to do that. I'm
Right.
not going to accept that you're my enemy, or we can find other ways to work around that. So this is not, I mean, it's not a precise formula, but I would urge that the kind of ideologies uh, that the U.S. Well, we know Chinese, Russian ideology, certainly U.S. ideology, that we have the best system, one of the most workable systems of all. We're caught up in our own beliefs and unwillingness to bend on this. And after 75 years of truly being the world's sole great superpower after the end of World War II, it's hard to break away from that concept. Maybe it's happening, but I am it again, it's a mindset issue. I'm not sure how we get out of one and into the other, I hate to say it, short of a terrible cataclysm of some kind. Not nuclear, but let's say economic collapse, in which clearly the old order is no longer tenable.
Well, I think this concept of changing mindset is absolutely critical, and I certainly share your implicit optimism. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I view this as an optimistic approach because, as you say, man is not a billiard ball. We can change. Our country was built on the idea that we can develop a system which is not only good for our nation, but for all nations. And we're now at that kind of turning point in history where that's required. And I think the Venezuela Caribbean crisis is just one of various flashpoints which has brought that to the fore. Graham, thanks a million for helping discuss this matter for our viewers, and we will stay in touch for further discussions as things proceed. Thanks again.
Good. Thank you, Dennis. These are fascinating and important issues. It's great to have a chance to look at them in a little bit of depth.
Appreciate it very much.
Good.